Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, Episode 20.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to the 20th episode of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Today's guest is Weer'd Beard. Weer'd Beard is a marine biologist, former anti-gunner, and blogger over at weirdworld.com. He's also a host of the Handgun Radio Live and co-host of the Assorted Calibers podcast. So head over to the show notes page, Out of Order James Kalita /Weer'd, W-E-E-R-D, and check out links to Weer'd Beard's articles, podcasts, and you can also sign up for our email list and get in touch with our sponsors. And now, here's Weer'd Beard. Weer'd Beard, welcome to the show.
Well, it's good to have you. It's good to be on the show.
So, you are one of the co-hosts of the
Assorted Calibers podcast.
Assorted Calibers podcast. Okay, great. Could you tell me a little about that?
So the show kind of got its start with another show called the Gun Blog Variety Cast that was formed by a friend of mine, Sean Sorrentino, and he contacted a bunch of people that he knew who ran gun blogs and said, hey, I'll either you'll volunteer or I'll pick a skill that I think you've got that you can bring to the show, and you'll each do a segment every week on that thing. So there's, was a guy who did computer stuff. There was, my co-host Erin Paulette did she runs a prepper blog. So she would do blue collar prepping. So it was actually prepping on a budget, which was really interesting. And one of the things that I did on my blog often was go to the anti-gun websites and find stuff that they were talking about and give their talking points and give rebuttals to combat them. And so it started off, the segment was called This Week in Anti-Gun Nuttery on the Gun Blog Variety Cast. And I fell in love with that. And Sean decided that he didn't want to do the show anymore. So when that show ended, I said, you know what? I've done a bunch of other podcasts. Why don't I go around and start producing a show? And so I went about to start making a show, and within my show I've got my segment, which is they call it the Weird Audio Fisk, where I do the exact same thing. I find it's mostly videos, sometimes it's audio recordings. I'll find stuff on like NPR or something where someone's talking anti-gun talking points, and I will take them and just systematically take them apart so people can understand it. And my rationale is not that there's going to be anti-gun people listening to my podcast. Unfortunately, I would love for people to be listening to all the podcasts from both sides, but I don't think that there's that much cross-pollination between anti-gun people and pro-gun podcasts. So instead, it is for pro-gun people who might suddenly bump into someone around the water cooler who will say something, and as a general rule, it's probably repeating something that they've heard somewhere else. And instead of having that knee-jerk reaction of this person's attacking me and you get into that fight or flight response, it's I know what this is, and I actually know something I can say that they might think or that might change their mind or get a conversation started.
That's a really great approach, because I think I hear some of the things that people come up with when they're talking to the anti-gun crowds, and they really can use some help. A lot of times it's just angry, or they revert to but the Second Amendment, and there's a lot out there that patient reasoning can refute.
I mean, it's tough because especially if you're sitting around talking about, that movie that, I watched, and someone goes, oh yeah, but I wish they didn't have so many of those darn assault weapons. Those things should be banned. And you're caught out of the blue,
Right.
Suddenly,
right.
And if you're someone that's got an AR at home, which if you're listening to this podcast, you've got an AR at home, that's going to seem as a personal attack to you, and you might just lash out. And if you end up saying some awful things to that person, you're not going to win over the heart or mind. And God forbid there's witnesses there, you might not come across as very charitable.
Right. Yeah. Oh, so I'm sure if I'd read or I'd heard that you started out as as being anti-gun. What was the evolution there? What inspired the change?
Well, so I grew up in Portland, Maine, and that is, for those who don't know, Maine is a very gun-friendly state. It's, north, it's very rural. Portland's the biggest city, and it's not that big a city. But the southern Maine is very liberal, and my folks are very, very liberal folks, and I started off very, very liberal. I've since had a lot of political evolutions as well. We can talk about that if you're so interested. But as far as the gun thing goes, my parents were very anti-gun, and going to school, all my school teachers were very anti-gun. It was kind of weird though, because I knew a bunch of people who owned guns. They were almost always hunters. And I mean, things like when I'd go over to my uncle's house, me and my cousins would go into his computer room and play video games on his computer, and hanging right over the computer was his, hunting rifle. And it really wasn't a concern. It wasn't anything weird, growing up. And also, the fact that it's in New England, like we took field trips to places where there were Revolutionary War battles. So despite me being anti-gun, I didn't think people should own guns. I definitely felt things like assault weapons were machine guns, and there was no reason to have that. And people who concealed carried were paranoid people looking for trouble. But at the same time, I always knew that the Second Amendment was for the government. It was for in case the government started doing horrible things like the British did to the American colonists, because we'd go to places where there'd be a stone that said, here are buried 14, British soldiers that were ambushed during the Revolutionary War. So, that was definitely my start. Does that make sense? Anything I need to clarify that?
No, that does make sense. Was there a certain tipping point where you said, it's kind of like you had those, you were anti-gun, but in the back of your mind, you knew that, the reason for the Second Amendment. But was there a tipping point where you just said, you know what, I really do think we need these kind of weapons? And well, I guess, what was the tipping point? Because I guess
that's the tipping point really started happening. I went to college. So I grew up in southern Maine. I went to college in central Maine at the University of Maine, and that is right in the dead center of the state and very much out in the middle of the woods. And so all of a sudden, and it's a state school, so there was a ton of people from the local high schools all just went there for college. So there was a lot more of the rural Maine woodsman type folks who were very much pro Second Amendment and pro gun. And I started just getting in little debates with people. That's just one way to pass the time, discuss issues. And I found that all of a sudden, instead of just having a bunch of nodding heads, like when I was living in southern Maine, when talking about, how horrible these modern guns were, suddenly people were, coming back at me and giving me some points that were taking me aback, and I didn't have rebuttals for, and I didn't know how to counter. And my natural response was, well, clearly these guys are lying or they're making something up. So I would go back to my dorm room and hop on my computer and just start reading up on some of the issues we talked about. And I started finding some stuff that didn't really line up. And right around the same time, I had a very close friend who lived in one of the neighboring towns around Orono, and his dad had a 100-yard shooting range in his backyard and a very, very nice gun collection. And he just said to me, "Hey, do you want to go shooting this weekend?" And it was one of those, it's, something to do. Yeah, let's go do it. And so went and was shooting, and absolutely that was a big turning point, because that was where I shot my first 1911, and I am absolutely in love with 1911 pistols. And I left his house that day going, I need to get me one of those 45s. Like that's
Yep.
something I need to have. I was still anti-gun. I was definitely more in that realm of I'm a gun owner but category, where it was one of those, I would like one of those, but I don't necessarily think that we need to expand on gun rights uh, and all of those things. And so, but I did college students, so I didn't have enough money to buy a gun. I also wasn't 21 at the time. I didn't realize that to buy a handgun, you need to be 21. I knew nothing about what the actual gun laws were in the country. And so I just started reading up on what the gun laws were and reading about guns and reading stats. And I think that was really where I started getting geeky and started looking up like, oh, here's the ballistics of a 30-06, which is that was the standard hunting gun that everyone seemed to have. Oh, you're going to go shoot at deer or even moose. Yeah, you just bring out your 30-06. And then suddenly realizing that, oh, a 223 or a 7.62 by 39 that are used in these assault weapons that were banned at the time. This was in 1999 that this was going on. Geez, that's less powerful than that. And I also learned, oh, this is semi-auto firearms. And semi-auto is just what all those other guns that I was shooting doing. They just fire and then you fire it again. And I'm like, so wait, these people that were telling me they're banning machine guns, they're lying to me. And I definitely got it was definitely betrayal was the first feeling that I had towards the gun control side after I was, besides just blatantly following it. And so I started looking up, the NRA talking points going, well, they must be just as big of liars. And I couldn't find nearly as much dishonesty on the NRA side, or really much at all on that. They were pretty straightforward and just could not find nearly the amount of just misleading information. So that definitely was the tipping point for all of a sudden I was pro gun, and then started researching on, gun violence numbers and gun control and, where there are higher crimes versus lower crimes and gun control, and realizing, oh, there's a lot more, there's a lot of liability to gun control versus in these pro gun areas. Because again, here I am in Maine. Maine's got a very, very low, violent crime rate, very, very permissive gun laws. And, so it's not the guns that are causing the problems. So I became pro gun. What actually got me to become the Second Amendment activist that I am now, though, was my girlfriend. We actually went to high school together. We started dating during college, but she moved down to Massachusetts for work, and I ended up following her down here, and realized that if I was going to start, if I was going to bring, I'd inherited one gun from a relative, a rifle from a relative, and if I was going to bring that down to Massachusetts, I needed to see what the laws were, and realized, oh, I need a permit. Okay. Because in Massachusetts, you need a permit to own a firearm. It's one of the few states that requires that. So, all right, I need a permit. And so I walked into the police station in Medford, Massachusetts, which where I moved to from Maine, and said, I'd like a permit. And I was talking to, I believe she was a secretary. I do not believe she was an actual sworn officer. And this woman said, oh, what permit would you like? Oh, what do you have? And she listed off the different kinds of permits. And I said, oh, do you need one permit for each kind of gun? Because she's like, this one will allow you to own rifles. This one will allow you to own handguns. I said, oh, if I have the handgun one, oh, the handgun one is good for rifles and handguns. Okay. Well, what's the one that allows you to conceal carry? And she looked at me right in the face and said, and my thoughts were, I was actually not pro concealed carry at that. Well, I wasn't against concealed carry in any way, shape, or form at that point in time, but I wasn't quite ready to do it. But I thought, if I'm filling out the paperwork, I might as well leave my options open. And she looked me right in the face and said, we don't issue those here. Now,
Wow.
let me note that I had not and did not, during any of this thing, give her my name. She did not know who I was. I was just somebody who walked in and was inquiring about gun permits. So this is the reaction that everybody got.
Right.
And that's very much actually how Massachusetts works. Is Massachusetts is a shall issue state when it comes to your concealed carry permit, or really your firearms permit. They can actually deny you the right to own a firearm here. I have not heard about them actually successfully doing so, just completely unfounded. So that's something that I think they're well aware is a court case they don't want to fight. But to get what's essentially called an unrestricted permit, so a permit that would allow you to concealed carry and own any firearm that's legal in the state of Massachusetts, it's shall issue, or excuse me, it's may issue. And really, it depends on what town you live in. Some towns, it is no issue. There's no way, unless you have political connections, there's no way you're going to get a carry permit. And then there's towns like the one I live in now, which is one of the ones that, no, under no circumstance are we going to deny you a permit. We don't play games. We give you the permit you ask for. I've even heard there's some towns that will, if the person they will only issue a lower level permit if the person is, in the 18 to 20 range, which is where the FID card for rifles and shotguns is for people who can't legally own handguns yet. For unless if you are over the age of 21, they will issue you a carry permit and just say, yep, it says right there, all lawful purposes. I want you to make sure you know the law and you follow the law. And I'm washing my hands of you.
Okay.
So that's how Massachusetts works. But yeah, just being denied a permit just because that's what we do. There's no, speaking of anti-gun talking points, they talk about may issue as it gives the police oversight. I am aware of no place that has may issue that has any form of police oversight. It is literally just we will deny every single person unless they give us an extraordinary circumstance. Usually it means that they are friends with somebody within the political system, or in the case of New York City, outright bribe people. That was uncovered recently.
I saw. Yeah. Yep. Special law firm that you go to bribe the police. Yep. Yeah.
And so that just made me hopping mad. And that was the start of, I started a live journal shortly after that. I had a live journal and I started actually using it as a political blog. And then I started my blog, weirdworld.com, shortly after that. And then started venturing into podcasts.
Wow. Great. And it's funny. We see that in New Jersey a lot too, where people are, either indifferent about firearms regulations, because the anti-gun crowd does do a good job of making it sound reasonable, right? So they'll be indifferent or anti-gun until the first time they go and try and buy a firearm, and then it just kind of hits you. It's like you're treated like a criminal, and it's not until you go through that process that you realize how much of an infringement it really is.
Well, people are perfectly comfortable to give away rights that they aren't using. I've actually bumped into a bunch of people who walked into a firearm shop and found out that no, they're a prohibited person, and they realized after the fact, oh yeah, I got caught with a joint when I was in college, and I didn't want to, do any jail time or get a long, a long court trial, or maybe even I've known some people who have pled. I don't know if these people, I know one friend of mine in college got caught, and he immediately did a plea bargain because he didn't want to get if he wanted to get a lawyer and fight it or figure something out, he was going to have to get his parents involved, and he would rather them not find out about it. And you just pled to a felony, so you are now a prohibited person forever. And I don't think that many of the people in that situation realize what they're getting into until, long after the fact.
Right. And you start hearing about cases too, where people, are told that they aren't, pleading guilty to felonies. They find out later that they are, and then, there's that whole definition where it's, any crime where you can be, or sentenced to more than a year in prison. So, that's really, it sounds specific, but it's really vague when you think like reckless driving, or DWI could get you disbarred from owning a firearm, depending on how it's written up and interpreted.
Yeah,
So
and it can be sentenced to a year in prison. It's not you're literally sitting in prison for a year or get a year sentence and are released early. No, you could get time served or a weekend in jail or just get a fine. But because in the sentencing guidelines that the judge was looking over, he could go up to a year in prison or 2 years in prison for this and chose not to. It doesn't make any difference as far as the federal law goes.
right, yeah, absolutely. And and then when they look at expanding these things, that it's already too much, especially when we find out that the ATF hasn't funded I forget the name of the program where they restore your firearms rights after you've had a felony, and they haven't funded that in over 10 years. So you think all these people who, it used to be, if you watch TV in the 90s, they talk about that one guy who got caught with a roach, and got 20 years in jail. He would be on the news all the time. Yeah. So that guy, he's probably gotten out by now. It's probably been more than 10 years, and he can't even apply to have his rights restored because that program is never funded. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's shameful. And also there's just the kind of thing of where if you live in a certain area of the country, you kind of assume, especially, this being a, United States, every state has its own laws, but you just kind of assume that every other state is very similar to yours. Like, I mean, I grew up in Maine, and in Maine, I mean, you could do everything in a gas station. There are gas stations that have FFLs up in Maine. And let's, what are those? You could go to a gas station, you could buy beer, wine, liquor, ammunition, night crawlers, clothing. There's, just the nature of just I'm just going to, go down to the convenience store for whatever, groceries. There's the stores that sell everything. And then suddenly I come here to Massachusetts and I go to buy a 6-pack of beer at the grocery store, and you can't do it. Wait, what? No, you got to go across the street to the liquor store to buy beer. Now the new thing here in Massachusetts is actually in the front of my grocery store. They've actually walled off a section, and you can actually walk out of the grocery store into a liquor store that does not have an exit out of it whatsoever. You have to walk right back into the liquor store. It's entirely contained in the grocery store. But you can buy beer, wine, and liquor, and then go right back out and continue your grocery shopping. There's a lot of those popping up. But people don't, when I tell people that have lived their whole life in Massachusetts, oh yeah, no, we just, walk down to the gas station and, buy a 6-pack of beer. You could just buy it in the grocery store. Oh, really? You could do that? It just assume that every place is like that. And I was certainly like that with Maine. Maine's has always been your pretty standard. They just recently went constitutional carry, but for my entire life, or at least my entire life living in Maine, it was a shall issue concealed carry state where you just needed to take the NRA basic pistol or equivalent or show that you were active duty military. They'd consider your military training good enough for them, and then pay, I can't remember if it's $100 or all that, and you get a 5-year concealed carry permit. And what's not ubiquitous around the country that I also realized much later on is that here in New England, yeah, once you get your carry permit, you can pretty much carry anywhere that it's legal, outside of, schools and courthouses and, your post offices and those sort of things that are pretty much universally, gun-free zones. But you could walk into a restaurant that serves alcohol, and that's perfectly legal, so long as you've got your concealed carry permit. In Maine, you can open carry without a permit. And,
nice.
And then on top of that, if it's legal, you can buy it in, Maine. Suppressors are legal. Everything NFA is legal. There's no assault weapons ban. There's no magazine restrictions. None of that sort of stuff. You just walk into your gun shop and buy it. Or if you've got a friend that's owns some guns, you can just, you can buy, sell, and trade. So just coming from that to Massachusetts, where, oh no, you have got to jump through so many hoops, and there's so many just weird gun laws here, and just onerous gun laws that I didn't even expect it when I came down here. Like people will say, "Oh man, you moved from Maine to Massachusetts and you're a gun owner. Man, you're stupid." Well, I kind of was. Yeah, I didn't even look before I left. I just assumed that, oh, it's might be a little bit worse, but how bad could it be? Oh wow.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the thing for people too, is that, you have all of these things that go on in your life. It's hard, especially if it's not your passion. It's hard to, say, well, I can't move to this state because they have this one bad rule. There's all these other reasons to live there. There's family, friends, the culture that's there, the other laws, and, it's hard to, people talk all the time about wanting to leave New Jersey. A lot of them do, but you have ties. There's reasons that you don't want to leave, and
I get a lot of people saying that move out of Massachusetts, and that's a valid statement, and absolutely there's a part of me that loves it, and I'm not going to I'm not going to retire in Massachusetts, that's for darn sure, but I've been here for 15 years now, and yeah, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. Just because, yeah, we've got there's good employment here. We're close to our family. There's a lot of other reasons for me to be where I am besides the fact that I'm a gun owner.
Right. Yeah. And yeah. Let's see. So I've been asking all my guests, and I keep saying that I'm going to start warning people. But are there any books that you would recommend, either gun related or liberty related, that gun owners should read?
Ooh, yes. Let me look up the exact title, because you didn't warn me. It's called On Guns and Violence.
Oh, okay.
It's by Joyce Lee Malcolm, I believe is her name. Let me just see if I can find. Let's see. Guns and Violence. Guns and Violence: The English Experience by Joyce Lee Malcolm. It's really a interesting thing. I think she was living in Massachusetts actually when she wrote it. I think she was part of Harvard or MIT when she wrote the book. But she studies English common law, and she goes back using historical records, and England being such a long time established society, there are crime statistics and court records going back to the medieval times, so long before even firearms existed. And she looks at violence and then guns and gun control laws in England, and essentially, spoiler alert, shows how it really hasn't worked out that well for the English. But very, very interesting, especially also that back in the medieval time, you could actually get in trouble for seeing a violent crime and not getting yourself into it, not trying to stop it. Kind of like that last episode of Seinfeld with the Good Samaritan law. There was actually a law like that in England. I believe it was in the Middle Ages. It's been a little while since I've read this book, but I would highly recommend that one. And that's one I don't hear about a whole lot.
Yeah, no, you're the first person to mention that one, so thank you. I will check it out. And I seem to remember hearing a podcast episode where she was interviewed, but I can't remember whose show she was on. So
I'll have to look that up. And actually, if you find it before I do, email me.
Okay, will do. Great. Well, I thank you for being on the show. When I put up the show notes page, where should we send people to find you?
So you can find me at my blog. That's weerdworld.com, WEERD world.com. Also the Assorted Calibers podcast. That's assortedcalibers.com. And let's see, I also do a podcast, Handgun Radio, on the Firearms Radio Network.
Oh, okay. Great. Very good. Handgun Radio. All right. Great. Well, I thank you very much for being on the show. Any parting words for our listeners?
Nothing super succinct. Just look before you leap if you're possibly going to move to a gun unfriendly place.
Okay.
And be aware of what the gun laws are in other places, and what things are like because, I mean, we've clearly seen for places. I mean, California had the assault weapons ban before we got the federal assault weapons ban, and everyone's the the universal background checks bill that Michael Bloomberg drafted is being pushed anywhere and everywhere. Is you need to be always looking at the gun politics around the country because the super duper anti-gun places, yeah, maybe it's a little unrealistic to think that next thing you're going to wake up and Pennsylvania is going to be California, but places like California and Massachusetts and New York are the testing grounds for a lot of these laws that might be coming to a state near you.
That is excellent advice. I thank you again for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Please head over to the show notes page, outoforderdameskalita.com/weird. That's WEERD. You'll find links to Weer'd Beard's blogs, our sponsors, and the books he recommended. This was my first episode syncing separate audio tracks. I think I got it right. So if you made it this far, I appreciate you putting up with it. We'll see you next time.